All right, today we are going to pick up in the book of Acts, chapter 27. And to get a backdrop of what's going on here, it's important that we have the right mood. All right, so we know where this story is going. So I have a tune I'm going to play for you. And if you're older than me, you should know this. And if you're younger than me, I think you'll still get it. So let's see what happens. See what memory comes back. How's that song ramp up at the end? 3 hour tour. Yeah, all right. Keep that in mind. A 3 hour tour. That's what we're going to get to here. All right, so we're headed for that. Acts chapter 27 starts out. Remember, we left Paul in Caesarea. He was hanging out under arrest there. He's assigned a centurion to take him to Rome. He's headed for trial. He's appealed to Caesar. Paul, some other prisoners, and other guards get on a ship, like a little coastal vessel. They have to stay close to shore. They go to Sidon, then they go on to Myra. And in Myra, they switch ships. They've changed from a coastal vessel to a large seagoing ship. It carries grain. It's a ship that's going from Alexandria. Oh, check out, I got a pointer. Oh, yeah. All right. I've already been told, don't use the privilege. Yeah, all right. So, Alexandria, Rome at this time is short on grain. They are hungry. And so they're sending grain from Alexandria up to Myra. And then from Myra, usually they go south of Rhodes and cut over and head up to Rome. This is late in the shipping season. Too late in the shipping season. They really shouldn't be out here now. But if you can get grain delivered now, a little bonus. This is kind of a good time to get it delivered. So they head out from Myra and they hit bad winds. So they stay north of Rhodes. They're trying to make it their way through, staying close to land so the wind protects them. They get out a little further and they shoot down below Crete. Again, trying to get the wind to protect them so they can make it. It's a horrible voyage. Lousy. They arrive at the port of Fair Havens, and this is what Paul has to share with his guards and the sailors. Sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of the cargo in the ship, but also of our lives. There's encouragement. All right, guys, go on from here. We'll loosen it all. And so the centurion and the ship owner and the pilot of the ship, they get together and they say, let's go to Phoenix. It's just 3 hours more. 3 hours. All right. So you got Gilligan's. The Ballad of Gilligan's Island, I believe, is the true name of that song. So you should have that flowing through your mind now. And we go on back to the slides. They take off. So all they have to do is go from Fairhaven to Phoenix. The reason they want to go on, the harbor's much better at Phoenix. And they know they're going to have to winter over now. They're just too late. They can't make it to Rome. So all we need to do is just get to Phoenix, a good harbor. And they make it out into the sea, and a northeaster comes up. The instant change of weather. Horrible winds, whirlwinds, all sorts of terrible stuff. And they start bailing cargo overboard, throwing tackle overboard, anything it takes so they can keep going along. Now remember, this is before the days of the compass. So the way they navigate is by sun and by stars. When you have a bad storm, it's kind of hard to navigate by sun and stars. They are hopeless. 14 days they're wandering around, and they aren't sure where they are. They're giving up hope. They're bailing everything out. And that's where we pick up the story today. Verse 21 of Acts chapter 27. As an aside, as someone who is very prone to motion sickness, I feel very badly for these guys at this point. All right? 14 days. When it talks about that they were going without food, it makes sense to me. I would as well. Verse 21. After the men had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, "Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourselves this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed." Last night, the angel of the God whose I am and whom I serve stood beside me and said, "Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island." So Paul starts out with, "I told you so." Oh, can you hear that? You should have listened to my advice. I told you so. I was a younger brother. I had that all the time. I offered that a lot. I told you so. That's not exactly what Paul's saying here. Paul's actually admitting he's wrong. Remember, we look at verse 10? He said, people are going to die if we keep going. And now Paul is saying, yeah, that was my advice. Actually, what God's plan is that none of us are going to die. So he's kind of eating his words, actually. He's saying, this is really God's vision. I was a little wrong before, but this is what God has to say. And so in many ways, he's talking about God's providence, that God has prepared a plan, God's going to deliver them. But there's a hard thing with God's providence, and that is it's not always what you want to hear. I have a fancy stamp on a cruise ship there. That's for the owner of the ship and the ship's pilot. This is not the plan they want to hear. I have good news for you, Mr. Ship Owner. Your ship is going to sink and all the cargo with it, and this might bring you financial ruin. But the good news is the prisoners are going to live. I doubt that's what they were looking for, a plan. I think about the centurion. I refer to him as Julie Baby, because it's Julius, Julie Baby, it just works. Alright, so he says, Julius, guess what? This plan that you have of going to Phoenix is a disaster. Everything's going to be lost, but you can still drag us the rest of the way to Rome. What a good deal for you. But think about Paul also. The prisoners. Good news, Paul. You get to live another day, so you can go stand on trial in Rome for a crime that you did not commit, and maybe enjoy some sort of Roman torture. God has a plan. God has a promise of something bigger than what these guys can see. But at the time, at the moment, I don't know if this is great news. I think each one of us can think of times in our lives in which we've been disappointed with how things unfolded. But maybe because we couldn't see the full picture, we lacked trusting God's plan. Rather than trusting that God has a bigger plan in mind than we can see at the time. Going back to Sandra's youth message this morning, the idea of we have bad weeks. We have a bad string of things that come together. Are we going to trust God in those times? God's providence. So hold on to that. Because each one of us has the question of where are you, God, at times? We're going to come back to that later. Let's read on and see what happens next. Verses 27 through 32. On the 14th night, we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea, when about midnight the sailors sensed they were approaching land. They took soundings and found that the water was 120 feet deep. A short time later, they took soundings again and found it was 90 feet deep. Fearing that we should be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. In an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let the lifeboat down into the sea, pretending they were going to lower some anchors from the bow. Then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved." So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it fall away. We're just talking about how God has a plan. And now this lays out, people have a responsibility to live out the plan. There is human responsibility. First, we have this anchor thing. 4 anchors are dropped. It's kind of, I guess, shipping common sense. They think they're going to crash into something, so lower the anchors so they don't hit the rocks. And the reason they're probably using 4 anchors is so you can keep the ship pointed in a certain direction. They're trying to stay focused, pointing into the wind, so they don't get turned sideways and capsize. So they have a responsibility. God says everyone's going to be saved is my plan, but He gives people a responsibility to live out the plan. The fascinating piece of this is the little rowboat part. The sailors are looking to escape. They say, "This is a sinking ship. It's time to get out of here." And so they're sneaking around, they're getting in a little lifeboat, they're lowering themselves down. And Paul bursts onto the scene and he says, "Julie, baby." It's in the Greek. So he says, "Julius, these guys can't leave. If you let these guys leave, God's plan is going to be broken. God has a plan for what people are going to do. People have a responsibility in this plan. We can all live, but if people don't do their job, think about it, Julie. If these guys go, who's going to run the ship? Who's going to make everything hold together until just the right time? Think about the responsibility God has given these guys. Don't let them go." It's interesting that God's promises and God's plans, God chooses to work through people. And He gives us responsibility. That question I asked before, that sometimes we face the question of where is God? Sometimes the question I think we have to face is where am I? Where am I in living out God's plan? Where am I in being there for people, living out the responsibility God has laid out for me? People who depend on me. Am I responsible? We're going to step back from Acts for a minute. I want to work through this tension of where is God and where am I a little bit. Does anybody remember the small nation of Biafra? It was a nation from 1967 to 1970, seceded from Nigeria. So this is a picture of Nigeria. The lower part of it was Biafra. On the cover of Life magazine, July 12, 1968, there was a picture of starving children. During the Civil War that ensued, about 1 million people died from starvation or the Civil War. A 13-year-old boy saw the copy, the cover of this Life magazine. It troubled him deeply. He went to his church, he went to his Sunday school that he went to, and he asked his pastor, he said, "If I am going to lift up my finger, does God already know which finger I'm going to lift up?" And the pastor said, "Yes, he knows that." The boy laid out the magazine cover and he says, "Well, does God know what's going to happen to these kids?" What the pastor said did not resonate with the boy. And this 13-year-old boy was Steve Jobs. Probably a name that's familiar. Revolutionized technology, Apple. According to his biographer, after that time, he never stepped back in church again. Never turned back to Christian faith. Because the disconnect between where is God and where am I was too big. That's a hard thing for us, isn't it? Each one of us knows painful things that happen in the world that don't make sense. Each one of us struggle with things. And we have to keep the tension of that God is in control, God is sovereign and has a plan. But at the same time, God is working through people. And we have a responsibility to bring about what God's plan truly is. That's a hard tension. But God has given us responsibility to do just that. Let's go on in the story. And keep that tension in mind of a sovereign God who gives us responsibility. We pick up with verse 33. Just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. For the last 14 days, he said, you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head. After he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. Then he broke it and began to eat. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. Altogether, there were 276 of us on board. When they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. Following verses talk about how they cut the anchors loose and they're headed for ground and they got stuck in a sandbar. And picking up in verse 42, the soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping. But the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to get on their planks or on pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone reached land in safety. I want to think a little bit more about providence and responsibility. But this brings a quiz. Toaster. What does that have to do with what we just read? They ate breakfast, sort of, yes. The ship is carrying grain. I hadn't thought about that. That's a good one. That's a good one. What did they eat at breakfast? Bread. Paul broke bread and gave thanks. Paul might not have been completely into this plan. Paul might not have been ecstatic of, ooh, I'm headed to Rome, all right. He gives God thanks for being sovereign. He gives God thanks for having a plan. He holds on to the fact that in the face of what doesn't look so great, he's going to trust God. Okay, the next picture, this is a stretch. All right, this was the final verses that we read.
Let's hope the other guys don't escape.
It's along those lines. You're on it. You're on it. What does this guy look like? A lifeguard. The soldiers say, we are not lifeguards. Sort of. They said, we don't want to lose any of these prisoners. That's our heads on the line. If these guys escape, we're done. So how about we just take care of these guys and we don't have to worry about, if they swim or if they just, if they can swim a long ways, whatever. We don't worry about it. But once again, God's plan takes place because someone is responsible. 3 questions. I want to hopefully bring this to life a little bit. 3 questions of how this passage should impact us. One is, do you trust God? And I think a way of knowing that is worry and concern. We know that worry is wrong. Those things that we don't have control over, that we still are all worked up about, that's worry. We know that if we trust God, worry should be more on the back burner. But we are pretty good at not calling things worry, but calling things concern. Concern are those things that we do have some control over. We have 2 different options of concern. Concern can't just be a circle, where we just brood about things and think, oh, I wish there was a better way to handle this. Or we can handle concern like Paul did, in which he prayed and found God's destination. He prayed and found out God's plan, and then was a part of getting from point A to point B. That's how concern should play out. Does your life unfold by chance? If you see your life as random, as just sort of happening, probably should talk to God about that. And even if you see God at work in your life, I want to challenge you with some homework. One is take a look at some old pictures. Remember what was going on then. And with the benefit of hindsight, look back and think, what did God do coming out of that time? Maybe a time that was good, maybe a time that was bad. What did God do? And another thing to do is maybe even make a timeline. Think about how God's been at work across the years. Last question for you. How responsible are you? This passage brings out very clearly that God has a plan. But his plan is utilizing people. Are you responsible for God to work through you? It's quite a challenge to think about. Who's depending on you? Family, friends, co-workers? Are you responsible?